High above the wasteland, past the ash clouds and broken satellites, the stars have watched everything with quiet indifference. Long before the bombs fell, Fallout's alternate America turned its eyes skyward, dreaming of distances no war could touch. That dream produced programs and machines whose blueprints still gather dust in terminals across the ruins. The space age in Fallout was never quite finished, and its unfinished edges remain among the most gentle discoveries this world left behind. Tonight we follow that dream softly. Before you drift off, maybe tap subscribe for more gentle videos and let me know where you're listening from tonight. As we begin with the quiet story of a world that once reached toward the stars, there is something quietly remarkable about the way Fallout's pre-war civilization looked at the night sky. In our own history, the space age arrived hand in hand with microchips and digital computers, sleek and miniaturized and efficient. In Fallout's alternate timeline, however, the transistor was never widely adopted, and the vacuum tube continued to reign as the heart of all computing technology for decades longer than it did in our world. This single divergence changed everything about how that civilization reached for the stars, and the result was a space age that looks unmistakably like something painted on the cover of a 1950s pulp magazine, all gleaming chrome and enormous engines and instruments that glow amber in the dark. The pre-war United States in Fallout had its own space administration, a federal body roughly equivalent to our own space agencies, but operating under the long aesthetic shadow of the atomic age. Their rockets were enormous, almost theatrical in their proportions, built around fusion and fission power systems that gave them extraordinary thrust, while their guidance computers, room-filling machines of spinning reels and blinking cathode tubes, handled navigation with considerably less precision than a modern pocket calculator could achieve. The power was undeniable, the elegance was questionable, but the ambition was absolute, and it drove engineers across the country to spend entire careers designing vehicles meant to slip past the upper atmosphere and into the silent dark. What makes this so fascinating to sit with quietly is that the space race in Fallout was not merely a scientific program. It was woven deeply into the culture of the pre-war world in a way that went far beyond the technical. Children grew up with space-themed toys and lunchboxes and breakfast cereals. Corporations built entire marketing identities around the romance of the stars. Vault Tech, Nuka-Cola, Robco, Poseidon Energy, all of them found ways to attach their names and products to the idea of cosmic exploration, because space meant progress, and progress meant profit. And in the pre-war world, those two things were always understood to mean exactly the same thing. The stars were a marketplace as much as they were a frontier, and the pre-war American understood both dimensions with equal comfort. The divergence from our timeline runs deep in ways that are easy to overlook. Because vacuum tube technology continued to advance rather than being replaced, the computers that guided pre-war spacecraft were physically enormous, but in some ways more robust than their digital counterparts would have been. They were harder to miniaturize but easier to repair with basic tools, which meant that the engineering culture around space travel emphasized redundancy and mechanical cleverness over algorithmic refinement. A pre-war rocket engineer would have been entirely at home under the hood of a 1950s automobile and equally at home reviewing the launch trajectory of an orbital vehicle because the underlying philosophy was the same. If you understand the machine, you can fix the machine, and if you can fix the machine, it will serve you faithfully. There is something gentle and a little melancholy about that worldview in the context of what eventually happened. The machines were built to last and built to be understood, and then the bombs fell and the machines outlasted everyone who understood them. Across the wasteland, pre-war technology still hums and blinks and waits, sometimes for centuries, doing exactly what it was told to do in the absence of anyone who remembers why it was told to do it. The space age left behind its own particular category of silent, patient, purposeful things, tracking dishes still rotating, orbital relays still transmitting, rockets still fueled, and waiting on launch pads that no human hand has touched in 200 years. Among the most significant pre-war aerospace companies in Fallout's history, ArcJet Systems occupied a unique position somewhere between the practical and the visionary. They were not the largest aerospace manufacturer in the pre-war United States, but they were among the most ambitious, and their ambitions took them into territory that most other companies never dared to approach. While competitors focused on atmospheric flight, on orbital delivery systems, on military contracts, and commercial applications, ArcJet turned its considerable engineering talent towards something much quieter and much stranger, the question of deep space communication. The facility that ArcJet Systems operated in what would become the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was a sprawling complex of testing chambers, assembly bays, and research laboratories, all centered around a single enormously important project known as the Deep Space Relay, or the DSR. The DSR was not a weapon, and not a transport vehicle, and not a satellite. It was, in the most straightforward terms, a listening post, or rather, a speaking post, a device built to project a signal outward into the galaxy with enough power and enough coherence that something, if something was out there listening, might eventually receive it and respond. The project was deeply speculative and was funded partly by the federal government and partly by private interest groups whose motivations were not always entirely clear from the archived records. What the ArcJet engineers built to power this transmission attempt was an engine of extraordinary capability. The XM-B booster engine, as it was designated in internal documents, was designed to generate plasma output at levels that far exceeded anything required for atmospheric flight. The engine was essentially a controlled star in miniature, a fusion-powered thruster that produced heat and pressure sufficient to propel a very large object through the vacuum of space at considerable velocity. In practical terms, it was also capable of functioning as a weapon of terrifying effectiveness if one were to stand in front of it while it was running, which is a fact that the wasteland eventually proved in the most direct and pragmatic way that the wasteland generally proves things. The Deep Space Relay project itself was never completed before the Great War. The facility had the engine, it had the transmission array. What it lacked, in the final months before the bombs fell, was a power source stable enough to run the array at full capacity without risk of catastrophic failure. The engineers were close. The archived terminal entries suggest they were weeks, or perhaps months, from a workable solution. But the war arrived before the solution did, and the facility fell silent, along with everything else. The engine sat in its testing chamber for 200 years, still attached to its fuel systems, still technically functional, waiting for an operator who never came. That silence is broken eventually when the Brotherhood of Steel sends a small team into the facility seeking to recover the engine for their own purposes. The fact that the engine survives intact speaks to the quality of pre war engineering in a way that no amount of description could fully convey. A machine built to last, built to be understood, built to serve, and it does, across 2 centuries of abandonment, precisely what its builders intended it to do. There is something very Fallout about that. The people are gone, but the ambition remains, encoded in steel and wiring and careful engineering, waiting for someone to come and remind it of its purpose. The deeper question that the Deep Space Relay raises, and which the Fallout universe never quite answers directly, is whether the pre war civilization was transmitting into an empty universe or a populated one. Given what eventually appears above the atmosphere, and that story belongs to a later section of this quiet journey, the question carries considerably more weight than the engineers at ArcJet may have realized when they first powered up their equipment. Somewhere in the Mojave Desert, not far from the old city of Boulder, there sits a testing facility that once belonged to one of the pre war world's most recognizable aerospace companies. Repcon Aerospace was not the most prestigious firm in the industry, and it was not the largest, and its corporate history includes a number of financial difficulties and ownership changes that suggest it was always somewhat precarious as a business. But Repcon built rockets that worked, and in the pre war aerospace industry, a rocket that worked was the thing that mattered above all other considerations. The Repcon test site was used in the final decades before the Great War to develop and test a line of rockets intended for medium range orbital delivery. The facility included a launch area, several testing bays, and an administrative complex with the particular blend of optimism and functionality that characterized pre war industrial architecture: clean lines, bright colors, a sense that everything happening here was part of a larger story of human progress that could only end well. The rockets that came out of this facility were not elegant by anyone's measure, but they were reliable, which made them valuable to the military and to the civilian space program alike. After the Great War, the Repcon facility fell quiet for many decades. Then something remarkable and deeply strange happened. A community formed within its walls, not of human survivors, but of ghouls, humans who had been transformed by radiation exposure into something that looked frightening, but retained full human consciousness and memory and feeling. These particular ghouls called themselves the Bright Brotherhood, after their leader, a deeply charismatic and genuinely thoughtful figure named Jason Bright, who had developed a religious philosophy built around the idea that his community had been chosen for a purpose that transcended the wasteland entirely. Jason Bright's belief system is one of the more quietly extraordinary pieces of spiritual world building in all of Fallout. He believed with complete sincerity and considerable intellectual sophistication that the radiation that had transformed him and his followers was not a curse, but a gift, a preparation for a journey to what he called the far beyond, a place across the stars where his people would find peace and a home that could not be taken from them. The fact that he was living in a rocket testing facility was not, to Jason Bright, a coincidence. It was evidence of a larger design, a gentle cosmic arrangement that had placed the right people in the right location at the right time for reasons that would eventually become clear. Whether Jason Bright was correct in any metaphysical sense is a question the Fallout universe leaves conspicuously open. What is not open to question is the practical dimension of what the Bright Brotherhood attempted. They spent years studying the Repcon facility, learning its systems, maintaining its rockets with whatever replacement parts and improvised materials they could find, and working toward an actual launch, an actual departure from the surface of the Earth, and a journey toward wherever the rockets could carry them. The level of technical competence this required from a community of irradiated wasteland survivors with no formal aerospace training is staggering to consider quietly. The rockets themselves were in genuinely functional condition beneath the damage of 2 centuries of abandonment, which again speaks to the quality of pre-war engineering in ways that are hard to overstate. Repcon built their vehicles to last, and last they did through the Great War and the long winter and the slow, painful rebuilding of what passed for civilization in the Mojave. When the courier eventually encounters the Bright Brotherhood, the rockets are close to ready, close enough that the question of whether to help or hinder the launch becomes one of the Mojave's more poignant decisions. There is something irreducibly moving about a group of beings that the wasteland has treated with consistent cruelty, choosing to respond by literally launching themselves off the planet. What happens after the launch is something the Fallout universe handles with characteristic restraint. The rockets disappear into the sky. The Bright Brotherhood are gone. Whether they found the far beyond or simply perished when their supplies ran out or their navigation failed is never confirmed, never resolved, left hanging in the desert air like the contrails of the engines themselves, visible for a moment, then absorbed into the blue, then gone entirely. It is, in the end, a story about hope taking the most audacious form available to it, and it is told with a quietness that makes it considerably more affecting than any dramatic resolution could have been. There is a place in the Mojave Desert where the pre-war United States hid one of its most impressive and quietly terrifying technological achievements behind the facade of a public utility project. Helios 1 was presented to the world as a solar energy facility, a vast array of heliostatic mirrors designed to capture sunlight and convert it into electrical power for the communities of the Nevada region. And it was, genuinely, a solar energy facility. The power it generated was real, and the infrastructure it fed was real, and the engineers who designed it were real engineers working on a real problem. But beneath the practical exterior of Helios 1 lay a second project, a classified military program that the Public Energy Mission was designed to disguise, and that second project was called Archimedes. Archimedes was, in essence, an orbital weapons platform powered by the sun. The heliostatic mirrors at Helios 1 were not only capable of collecting solar energy for ground level use, they were also capable, when correctly aligned, of focusing an enormous concentration of reflected solar energy onto a satellite positioned above the facility in geosynchronous orbit. That satellite, Archimedes I, received the collected energy and stored it, and from there it could be redirected through a targeting system down toward the surface in a concentrated beam of sufficient intensity to destroy almost anything it touched. The targeting system was designated Archimedes II, and the device used to aim it was small enough to fit in a child's hands. The child in question is a boy named Max, who wanders the Mojave in the company of his grandmother, carrying what he believes to be a toy. The device is called Euclid's Sea Finder, and it looks, to the casual observer, exactly like the colorful plastic toy it was designed to resemble, a pointing device with a lens on one end and a trigger on the other, the kind of thing a child might use to indicate imaginary targets during an imaginary battle. In reality, it is a military targeting laser, and if it is brought to Helios 1 while the Archimedes system is active, it can direct an orbital energy strike with enough destructive power to leave a substantial crater in the desert floor. That a child carries this object around as a game, completely unaware of what it actually is, might be the most perfect summary of Fallout's relationship with pre-war technology that the series has ever produced. The Archimedes system raises a question that the Fallout universe sits with rather than answers. How many similar installations exist or existed across the pre-war landscape? Helios 1 is remarkable not because it is unique, but precisely because it represents a category of facility, a class of hidden military capability embedded within civilian infrastructure that the pre-war government clearly considered a viable strategic approach. The solar weapon was not a desperate improvisation, but a planned program, carefully engineered, carefully disguised, carefully maintained, right up until the moment when there was no one left to maintain anything. What the NCR and the Brotherhood of Steel and the various factions of the Mojave find at Helios 1, 200 years later, is a powerful system operating at a fraction of its designed capacity, misunderstood by nearly everyone who encounters it, and waiting for someone who understands it well enough to make a decision about its future. The fact that this decision can be made by a single wanderer carrying a targeting device found in the hands of a child is a piece of Fallout design philosophy made manifest. In this world, power is not held by institutions, but by individuals with sufficient knowledge, and knowledge is scattered through the ruins in the most unexpected containers imaginable. The Archimedes weapon fires once when fully activated, a single overwhelming discharge of collected orbital solar energy that strikes its designated target with a precision that the rest of the wasteland's technology can only dream of. After that single shot, it must recharge, a process that the archived documentation suggests will take several decades at minimum. One shot, decades of recharging. The weapon is almost perfectly emblematic of the wasteland itself, enormous in its capability, catastrophically limited in its sustainability, built for a world that no longer exists, doing its best in a world it was never designed for. In the ruins of pre-war San Francisco, or what was once San Francisco, there existed in the decades following the Great War a religious organization of singular strangeness and genuine fascination. The Hubologists, as they called themselves, were a group whose beliefs centered on the idea that the human mind was encumbered by what they termed neural inhibitors, psychic residue accumulated across multiple lifetimes that prevented true spiritual advancement. The process of clearing these inhibitors, which they called zoning, was the central sacrament of the Hubologist faith, and it was pursued with a dedication that ranged from sincere and peaceful to genuinely alarming depending on who was doing the pursuing. What made the Hubologists particularly remarkable in the context of Fallout's space lore was not their religious practices, but their destination. The ultimate goal of Hubologist theology was not enlightenment in any earthly sense. It was departure. The faith held that once a being had been sufficiently zoned, it was ready to ascend to the stars, literally, physically, in a spacecraft, and join a community of beings beyond the atmosphere who existed in a state of perfect spiritual clarity. This belief was not metaphorical. The Hubologists genuinely intended to launch a spaceship. The spacecraft they had acquired for this purpose was a pre-war shuttle, a remnant of the old space program that had been preserved, whether by luck or design, through the decades of devastation. The shuttle was functional in the sense that its structural integrity had held and its fuel systems were largely intact. What it lacked were certain critical components, specifically the power cells and navigational equipment necessary to make an actual launch survivable. The Hubologists spent years working toward acquiring these components because the departure of their community into the celestial realm was not a distant theological aspiration, but an imminent operational plan. The question of whether the Hubologists were sincere or simply confused is one that the Fallout universe treats with its characteristic even-handedness. Their leader, known as AHS-9, was by most accounts genuinely devoted to the principles of the faith, genuinely convinced that departure from Earth was both possible and spiritually necessary. The followers who gathered in San Francisco were, in many cases, people who had found in Hubology a framework for making sense of a devastated world and the promise of leaving that world behind for something better was not, psychologically speaking, very different from what any number of other wasteland religions promised in slightly different language. What is distinctively Fallout about the Hubologist story is its ending. When the shuttle is eventually launched, under circumstances that depend entirely on what choices a wanderer makes in the ruins of San Francisco, the Hubologists discover that belief, however sincere, does not substitute for proper launch protocols. The shuttle departs. It achieves altitude. And then something goes catastrophically wrong, because preparing a spacecraft for launch requires more than spiritual devotion, and the technical gaps in the Hubologist's preparation are ultimately fatal. The faith carried them as far as faith could carry them, which was in the end not quite far enough. There is a quality of tragedy in the Hubologist story that the game handles without sentimentality. These were people with a genuine dream, people who took the most impractical and audacious response to the end of the world and pursued it with absolute commitment. The fact that their dream did not work does not make the dreaming less real or less poignant. Somewhere above the ruins of San Francisco, there is a shuttle that tried, carrying the memory of people who believed that the stars were better than the wasteland, and who may, in the final accounting, have been right. The wasteland is large, and its secrets are many, but some secrets announce themselves with a directness that is almost startling in its contrast to the surrounding ruin. Among the quietest and most consistently fascinating of these announcements is the presence of crashed alien spacecraft, vehicles that clearly did not originate on Earth, rendered identifiable by their distinctive circular hull designs and the green tinted energy systems that still pulse softly among the wreckage, even centuries after impact. In the capital wasteland, near the ruins of a town called Minefield, and not far from a settlement called Arafu, a careful explorer can find a site where something came down hard enough to leave a scar in the earth, visible from a considerable distance. The object that made that scar was not a meteor, and not a pre war aircraft, and not any type of ordnance that appears in the records of the old U.S. military. It is a spacecraft of clearly non terrestrial design, small enough to have been a scout or a courier vessel rather than anything larger, and its hull is decorated with markings that match nothing in any pre war human language or script. The craft has been there long enough that the ground around it has settled back into something approaching normalcy, but the wreckage itself resists the weathering that has consumed everything else in the area, which suggests that whatever materials the craft was built from were not subject to the ordinary processes of oxidation and decay. In the Mojave, another site marks where something similar came down, this one northwest of a farmstead, whose own history is complicated enough that most travelers pass it without stopping. The Mojave crash site is slightly larger than its capital wasteland counterpart, and the distribution of the wreckage suggests the craft was moving faster when it hit and may have been damaged before impact rather than damaged by it, as though whatever brought it down had wounded it first, and the earth merely finished the process. Near the wreckage, the explorer willing to be patient will find the remains of whoever or whatever was aboard, and among those remains, a weapon that operates on principles that bear no relationship to any technology developed by human hands. Fallout 4 presents a crash site of particular delicacy and craft. The player who follows a strange radio signal through the Commonwealth will eventually trace it to a hilltop where a small craft has come to rest, and the beacon it is broadcasting is not an emergency signal of the kind any pre war emergency system would have generated. The signal is something else, more structured, more deliberate, transmitted with a regularity that suggests the system producing it is not malfunctioning, but functioning exactly as designed, drawing something toward the wreckage with a patience that implies the transmitter has been waiting for a very long time. What connects all of these sites is their restraint. The Fallout universe never presents crashed UFOs with drama or fanfare. They are simply there, worked into the landscape with the same matter-of-fact quality that the series applies to all its environmental storytelling, present for whoever notices, silent for whoever passes by, carrying implications that expand the further one thinks about them without ever demanding that those implications be acknowledged. The universe is larger than Earth. Things come and go through it. Some of them come down. This is treated quietly and consistently as a fact about the world rather than an event in it. And that restraint is what makes the sights feel genuinely mysterious rather than merely dramatic. Above the atmosphere of the capital wasteland, invisible to anyone on the surface looking up, there hangs a spacecraft of a scale that dwarfs anything the pre war space program ever built or imagined building. Mothership Zeta is not a vessel designed for any purpose that human engineering has ever addressed. It is not a warship exactly, though it carries weapons. It is not a research facility exactly, though it conducts experiments. It is something older and stranger and more patient than either of those categories suggests. A vessel that has been hovering above the Earth for longer than the United States existed, collecting, observing, experimenting, and waiting with a thoroughness that implies a mission profile of extraordinary depth and duration. The scale of the ship becomes apparent slowly as one moves through it, and the experience of moving through it is deliberately disorienting in a way that speaks to how carefully its designers thought about the architecture of alienness. The corridors are not quite the right width. The lighting operates on a spectrum that is subtly wrong in a way that is difficult to pinpoint but impossible to dismiss. The surfaces are smooth in a way that suggests they have never known the ordinary wear of daily use, as though the ship maintains itself somehow, or as though it was built so well that 200 years or 2,000 years of continuous operation have failed to leave any mark on it. What the ship contains is, in many ways, more remarkable than the ship itself. Mothership Zeta has been collecting human beings for centuries, preserving them in a state of suspended animation, studying them with instruments whose purpose is not always immediately apparent. The humans preserved aboard come from different eras of American history. A samurai from Edo period Japan who was abducted and brought to the ship centuries before the pre-war period began. A cowboy from the frontier era of the American West. An American soldier whose abduction occurred during the Great War itself. And a young girl taken from her family in the final days before the bombs fell. Each of these individuals represents a data point in whatever study the ship's crew has been conducting, a longitudinal examination of humanity across time, measured in individual specimens gathered at intervals across the centuries. The samurai is named Toshiro Kago, and he has been in stasis so long that the world he came from is entirely unrecognizable to him. The cowboy is named Paulson, and he carries the same quiet toughness that the frontier demanded of everyone who survived it. The soldier is named Elliot Turkorian, a medic who was practicing his trade at the moment of his abduction, and who, when revived, immediately returns to that practice with a steadiness that speaks to what combat medicine trains into a person at a fundamental level. The girl is named Sally, and she has adapted to the ship with the particular resilience that children sometimes demonstrate in circumstances that would crush adults, not by denying the strangeness of her situation, but by incorporating it so completely that it simply becomes her normal. The aliens who operate Mothership Zeta are not interested in communication in any way that the humans aboard can access or replicate. They are observers and collectors, not diplomats or explorers in any sense that maps onto human conceptions of those activities. Their experiments on the humans they collect are not cruel in any deliberately sadistic sense. They seem to be conducted with something approaching scientific detachment, though that detachment is itself disturbing in the way that perfect indifference always is when it is directed at a person. What they are learning from their collection of humans is never made explicit, and the mystery of their purpose is one that the Fallout universe wisely declines to resolve. The technology aboard the ship operates on principles that have no equivalent in any pre war human science. The weapons are energy based, but of a type that goes beyond plasma or laser technology. The medical systems can heal injuries with a speed that borders on instantaneous. The propulsion systems are apparently capable of moving the ship from orbit to deep space without the enormous fuel expenditures that human rocket technology requires. In the inventory of alien items collected from the ship, the energy cells, the tools, the remnants of systems whose purpose can only be guessed at, there is a catalog of answers to questions that pre war Earth scientists had barely learned to formulate properly. The fact that this ship has been present above the Earth throughout the entirety of Fallout's history, before the bombs, during the Great War, and through 2 centuries of post war rebuilding, raises a question that the game poses without commentary. Were the aliens aware of the Great War? Did they observe the exchange of nuclear weapons that ended the pre war civilization? What did they make of it from their position above the atmosphere, watching the lights go on and off across a continent? The answer is not available, and perhaps that is appropriate. What the watchers thought of what they watched is not something the watched can know, and there is a particular humility in the Fallout universe's decision to leave it that way. There is a recurring object in the Fallout universe that appears with quiet consistency across the geography of the wasteland, discovered near crash sites, recovered from alien remains, occasionally found in the possession of pre war collectors who somehow obtained one in the decades before the Great War. It is a handgun of sorts, if the category of handgun can be stretched to accommodate something that fires bolts of energy capable of reducing a human being to a fine green mist. The alien blaster, as it has come to be known across the games, is perhaps the clearest evidence that something from beyond the solar system has been taking an interest in the Earth for a very long time. What is most remarkable about the alien blaster is not its destructive capability, considerable as that is, but its design. The weapon is small enough to be held comfortably in one hand and has the general shape of something a designer might have produced if asked to imagine what an alien weapon would look like, rounded where human weapons are angular, smooth where human weapons are textured, operating through mechanisms that contain no moving parts visible to the naked eye. The power cells that the weapon uses are incompatible with any pre war human ammunition system, which means that once the cells are expended, there is no replacing them from any human source. The weapon becomes, eventually, a beautiful and completely inert object, a relic whose usefulness has been consumed and whose remaining value is entirely in what it says about the universe beyond the Earth. The energy signature produced by the alien blaster's discharge is distinctive enough that a careful analyst could, in theory, identify a shot fired by this weapon as having come from a non human source, even if the weapon itself were never recovered. This has implications for certain events in Fallout's lore that are left deliberately ambiguous, moments of unexplained destruction whose circumstances could, if one were inclined toward a particular interpretation, suggest that the aliens have not always been content to merely observe from above. Whether this interpretation is correct or merely a pattern that a meaning hungry mind is imposing on random events is, like so many questions in the Fallout universe, left entirely to the individual doing the wondering. What the alien blaster tells us, quietly and without drama, is that the Fallout universe has always been larger than any single game's scope. It was always a universe in which the Earth was known to other civilizations, in which the boundary between the atmosphere and space was a threshold that non human intelligences crossed with apparent regularity, in which the conventional categories of the post war struggle, factions, ideologies, resources, were nested inside a much larger context that none of the struggling parties had any way to perceive. The Wastelander who finds an alien blaster and uses it to survive another day in the Mojave or the Commonwealth is holding a piece of a story whose scope vastly exceeds anything either they or the game's narrative ever fully address, and that particular quality of vastness, glimpsed but not grasped, is one of the things that makes these moments so quietly resonant. Before the bombs fell, in the comfortable homes of suburban America, children played with a toy that captured the excitement of the space age in a form small enough to hold in both hands. Jangles the Moon Monkey was a stuffed toy in the shape of a chimpanzee wearing a miniature astronaut suit, complete with a helmet, a suit decorated with the insignia of the space program, and the cheerful, slightly wide eyed expression that all good toys of that era seemed to share as a design principle. The toy was enormously popular, produced in enormous quantities, and distributed to children across the country as a symbol of a space age that was supposed to be just beginning. The fact that Jangles the Moon Monkey survived the Great War in enormous quantities is a testament to the durability of pre-war manufacturing. Across the Commonwealth and beyond, these small, plush astronauts can be found in remarkable preservation in children's bedrooms, in toy chests, in the backpacks of small skeletons, in school corridors, arranged on shelves in playrooms where the rest of the room has long since collapsed into ruin. The toy outlasted the children who played with it, outlasted the parents who gave it, outlasted the civilization that produced it. Jangles the Moon Monkey endures. The cultural history embedded in this single toy is worth sitting with for a moment. Jangles was not invented for the Fallout universe by its designers without precedent. The pre-war space program did use chimpanzees in early missions, as did our own, as a way of testing whether biological systems could survive the conditions of spaceflight before risking human lives. The Jangles toy was a domesticated version of that history, a way of translating the drama and significance of the space age into something a child could hold and name and carry to bed. The space program, through Jangles, became intimate and friendly and accessible, not a technical program conducted by engineers in distant facilities, but a story of a brave little monkey who went to the moon and came back safe. That the children of the pre war world grew up with jangles in their arms, and then many of them died in the bombs or in the decades of devastation that followed, is the kind of detail that the Fallout universe places in front of you without underscoring. The toy is simply there, in whatever room you find it in, carrying the full weight of what it represents without any additional narration. It is a fragment of a childhood that ended catastrophically and an artifact of a cultural dream that was extinguished before it could fully unfold. And it is, despite all of that, a cheerful little monkey in a spacesuit, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about the relationship between hope and the world that hope has to survive in. In Fallout 4, a particularly beloved jangle specimen plays a role in a child's story, a robot companion named Codsworth who has been waiting for 200 years for the family he was built to serve, and who preserves in his memory banks the particulars of a child's attachment to a specific Jangles toy with a specificity and tenderness that is genuinely moving. The toy is just a toy, and the toy is also an entire childhood, frozen in the memory of a machine that has had 2 centuries alone to think about what was lost. That is Fallout's space lore in miniature, the grandeur of the cosmic dream reflected in the most domestic and intimate of objects. In the mountains west of the Commonwealth, before the Great War, there existed an amusement park of extraordinary scale and ambition, a destination that the Nuka-Cola Corporation had built as a monument to its own brand identity and to the cultural moment of the space age that had made brands like theirs synonymous with American optimism. Nuka World was divided into themed areas, each one representing a different facet of the pre-war cultural landscape, and among the most elaborate and meticulously designed of these areas was the Galactic Zone, a section of the park devoted entirely to the romance of space travel, cosmic exploration, and the particular aesthetic of a future that the pre-war world was still convinced it was building. The Galactic Zone was constructed around a central attraction called Starport Nuka, a structure designed to look like a space station of enormous proportions, all gleaming white surfaces and dramatic lighting and the kind of architectural confidence that comes from believing absolutely that what you are building represents the shape of things to come. Around Starport, Nuka clustered a constellation of smaller attractions and shops and experience areas, each one themed around a different aspect of the space age that Nuka-Cola and the pre-war space program had collaborated to make into a consumer narrative. There were simulated rocket launches. There were exhibits about alien life, framed with the cheerful certainty that contact was only a matter of time, and that when it came, it would be friendly and profitable. There were ride systems designed to simulate zero gravity, which were considerably less comfortable than the marketing material suggested. Among the most quietly remarkable attractions in the Galactic Zone was a Vault Tech sponsored exhibit called Vault Tech Among the Stars. This attraction was, from a marketing perspective, a piece of brand synergy between 2 of the pre-war world's most powerful corporations, a chance for Vault Tech to present its Vault program to the visiting public in the most flattering possible light, wrapped in the excitement of the space age. The exhibit presented the vaults as the first step in a journey that would eventually take humanity to the stars, casting the grim reality of underground survival in the most romantic possible frame. Visitors who rode the Among the Stars attraction left understanding the vaults as launching pads for a cosmic future rather than as laboratories for experiments whose true nature Vault Tech was very careful not to discuss in this particular venue. The irony of this presentation is absolute and presumably unintentional. Among the Stars promised a journey from the vaults to the galaxy. What the vaults actually provided was, in most cases, a journey from the surface to a sealed container where various forms of suffering were systematically applied to the people inside. The gap between the attraction's promise and the reality it was dressing up is so large that it functions as a kind of accidental monument to the pre war world's capacity for self deception, the ability to look at something and see something else entirely, to take what was dark and make it gleam, to build a theme park around a lie and decorate it with the stars. In the present of the game, Nuka World has been taken over by raider gangs, and the Galactic Zone has become a territory haunted by malfunctioning robots dressed as aliens and astronauts, still going through the motions of the attractions that haven't run properly in 200 years. The star cores that the park's systems require for proper operation are scattered throughout the galactic zone, and collecting them in sufficient quantities allows certain systems to be restarted, a process that is both practically useful and quietly melancholy in what it reveals about the park's continuing mechanical loyalty to its original programming. The robots are still trying to entertain visitors who stopped coming 200 years ago. They are doing their jobs with a persistence that is either admirable or heartbreaking, depending on what mood one brings to the encounter. In the universe of Fallout, the moon bears the mark of human visitors. The alternate history of the pre war world included a space program capable of reaching Earth's natural satellite, and the Virgo 2 lunar lander was one of the vehicles through which that program achieved its most visible success. The lander sits in the historical record of Fallout's pre war civilization as evidence that whatever else the pre war United States failed at in its final decades, it succeeded in placing human beings on the moon with sufficient reliability that the mission was one of several rather than a singular, unique achievement. The Virgo 2 mission is referenced in various pieces of pre war media scattered throughout the games, advertisements, commemorative items, educational materials found in schools and libraries, and the consistency of these references suggests that the lunar program was a genuine point of national pride in the pre war culture, much as it was in our own history during the corresponding period. The differences lie in the details. The pre war space program operated with vacuum tube computers and analog guidance systems and fusion powered engines, which meant the engineering solutions to the problems of lunar travel were substantially different from those developed in our own history, even if the destination and the achievement were the same. What the moon represented in Fallout's cultural landscape was the same thing it represented in our own during the space age. Proof that ambition was not merely aspiration, but achievement, that the distance between here and there could be crossed by human ingenuity, applied patiently and carefully enough. For the pre war citizens who grew up watching images of lunar landings on their cathode ray televisions, the moon was evidence of what the civilization they were part of was capable of, which made its light, when it appeared in the sky above their cities and towns, a somewhat different kind of light than it had been for previous generations. It was a light that now meant something specific. Humans had been there. Humans had stood in that reflected glow at its source and looked back at the Earth. After the Great War, the moon continues to appear in the Fallout universe as it always has, unchanged, unhurried, carrying on with its ancient schedule of phases without reference to what has happened on the planet below. The lunar landers that various programs placed on its surface are presumably still there because there is nothing on the moon to disturb them. In a universe where almost everything built by human hands on Earth was eventually destroyed or irradiated or consumed by 2 centuries of entropic decay, the things placed on the moon survive with a perfection that is slightly uncanny. The moon, in Fallout, is the most complete archive of the pre war world, a museum whose collection is perfectly preserved and absolutely inaccessible, holding the marks of a civilization's greatest technical achievement in permanent silence. In the mountains of what was once West Virginia, there are facilities that represent perhaps the most direct expression of the pre war military's relationship with space that survives into the post war world. The nuclear missile silos scattered across Appalachia, designated Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie by the military command structure that built and operated them, are, in the most precise technical sense, orbital weapon systems. The missiles they contain are capable of following a trajectory that carries them above the atmosphere before bringing them back down on a target that can be located anywhere on the planet's surface. This is not quite the same as a permanently stationed orbital platform, but the distinction is one of degree rather than kind, and the silos represent a category of military technology whose fundamental premise is that the atmosphere is not a ceiling, but a medium, something to go through, not something to stop at. The command structures built around these silos in Appalachia were elaborate and carefully secured, designed to prevent unauthorized launch while maintaining the ability to respond to an authorized command with minimal delay. The automated systems that still operate within the silos 2 centuries after the Great War are among the most impressively preserved pieces of pre war technology in the Fallout universe, functional, loyal to their programming, maintaining their readiness postures with a mechanical dedication that the human beings who installed those postures cannot any longer replicate. The silos are ready. They are waiting for authorization codes that must be gathered from scattered locations across Appalachia by whoever wishes to use the system, a process that the original architects designed as a security measure, but which now functions as something closer to a treasure hunt for survivors with apocalyptic ambitions. The question of what it means to possess the ability to launch a nuclear missile in the post war world is one that Fallout 76 treats with considerable moral seriousness. Beneath its more accessible surface, the power to call down an orbital strike is available, in theory, to anyone who gathers the required materials and enters the required codes, which means it is power available to people who have no institutional legitimacy, no democratic mandate, no accountability to anyone who might survive the strike. It is the extreme logical conclusion of what happens when the structures that give power its justifications are removed, but the power itself remains. The silos do not ask whether the person entering the launch codes has the right to do so. They ask only whether the codes are correct. The orbital strike itself, when it falls on Fisher Prime in the event known as Scorched Earth, is one of the most spectacular demonstrations of pre-war military technology still functioning in the games. A nuclear warhead comes down from above the atmosphere and strikes a designated point with a precision that reflects the extraordinary engineering investment made in the guidance systems of these particular weapons. The explosion it produces is visible from an enormous distance and leaves a mark on the landscape that will presumably outlast everyone alive to observe it. It is a moment of tremendous destructive power, made somehow more affecting by the fact that the weapon was waiting patiently in its silo for 200 years for exactly this kind of purpose, and delivered exactly what it was built to deliver, exactly when asked, exactly where directed. The weapon worked. The civilization that built it is gone. The weapon does not seem to notice the distinction. Of all the factions that survived the Great War with enough organizational continuity to be considered institutions rather than merely survivors, the Enclave is the one that most clearly maintained a relationship with space-based technology. This is a consequence of who the Enclave was and what resources they had access to, a collection of high-ranking government and military officials and their families who retreated before the bombs fell to prepared installations whose nature and location had been kept secret from the general public. These prepared installations included access to infrastructure that most surviving communities could never have built or maintained, and among that infrastructure was a satellite communications network of considerable sophistication. The Enclave's satellite network served multiple purposes in the post-war period. It allowed communication between geographically distant Enclave installations without relying on the ground-based infrastructure that the Great War had largely destroyed. It provided surveillance capability that gave Enclave commanders a view of the wasteland's geography and populations that no other faction could approach. And it gave the Enclave a sense of continuity with the institutional identity of the pre-war United States government, a sense that they were not merely survivors, but the legitimate continuation of what had come before, with all the technical capability that legitimacy implied. The infrastructure required to maintain even a partial satellite network in the post-war world is staggering to contemplate. Satellites in geosynchronous orbit can remain functional for decades on solar power alone, but the ground stations required to communicate with them, to interpret their transmissions, and to direct their systems require maintenance and expertise that most wasteland communities could not sustain. The fact that the Enclave managed this for as long as they did reflects the quality and quantity of the technical personnel they preserved in their preparations, people who knew how pre war systems worked and who taught that knowledge to their successors across generations of enclave existence. The satellite relay stations that appeared across Fallout's landscape, antenna arrays in remote locations, signal towers connected to underground processing facilities, uplink installations in places where no ordinary community would ever have thought to build them, are in many cases as remnants of this enclave network. They also represent something larger: the pre war government's investment in the idea that the sky was not the limit, but an asset, a domain to be used as actively as any terrain feature. The pre war military understood space as a dimension of warfare in the same way it understood land and sea and air, and it built accordingly. And some of what it built still functions, still transmits, still watches from above the atmosphere with the patient electronic attention of systems whose human operators are long dead. Among the artifacts of the pre war space age that persist into the wasteland, there is a category of objects that speaks particularly directly to the physical reality of space travel. The suits designed to keep human beings alive in the vacuum beyond the atmosphere. Spacesuits of various types can be found throughout the Fallout universe, ranging from full pressure suits with integrated helmet systems to lighter vacuum sealed garments designed for short duration extravehicular activities. They are found in space agency facilities, in the collections of pre war enthusiasts, in the storage lockers of facilities that had reason to keep them on hand, and occasionally in locations that are difficult to explain by any conventional logic. The construction of a pre war spacesuit in Fallout's alternate technology timeline is a particular point of quiet interest. Because the pre war world's technology was based on vacuum tubes and mechanical systems rather than digital electronics, the systems integrated into a spacesuit were more mechanical in nature than their real world equivalents. Life support systems were driven by pumps and valves that a careful technician could service with hand tools. Pressure monitoring was done with analog gauges rather than digital sensors. Communication systems were radio based, using the same tube driven technology as every other communication system in the pre war world. This made the suits more robust in some respects and more fragile in others, less susceptible to electronic failure, but more dependent on mechanical components that could degrade and wear in ways that electronics do not. The Nuka World Galactic Zone preserves several examples of pre war spacesuits in remarkably good condition, which is a testament to how carefully the park's environmental systems maintained their exhibits. The suits were originally placed on display as attractions, artifacts of the real space program that visitors could view up close and in some cases touch, giving the Galactic Zone the quality of both an amusement park and a museum. After 2 centuries of abandonment, these suits remain among the better preserved physical evidence of the pre war space age, available anywhere in the wasteland, their silver exteriors still reflecting the park's atmospheric lighting, with something approaching their original luster. What a spacesuit represents, in its simplest form, is the acknowledgement that human biology was not designed for the environment it has decided to explore. The suit is an admission of vulnerability, a concession to the reality that the space the pre war world was so excited about was actually lethal to human beings in its natural state, requiring an elaborate technical intervention just to allow a human body to be present without immediate fatal consequence. There is something quietly humbling about that, and the Fallout universe seems aware of it. The spacesuits in the wasteland are not triumphant artifacts, they are protective ones. They speak of a civilization that went somewhere it had no business being and built extraordinary things just to make the visit survivable. The Great War was the culmination of a conflict that had been intensifying for decades between the United States and China, a conflict over resources, principally oil, but also over the fundamental shape of the coming century. Both nations understood that the country which controlled the most capable military technology would be positioned to set the terms of the world that emerged from the standoff, and both nations invested accordingly in every technological domain they could access. The competition extended to space, where both countries pursued programs whose military dimensions were at least as significant as their scientific ones. Chinese orbital technology in the Fallout universe is mentioned in scattered pieces of pre war documentation without ever being described in detail, which gives the subject a quality of implication and inference rather than direct knowledge. What can be assembled from these fragments is that China maintained at least a modest orbital presence in the period leading up to the Great War, satellites for communication and surveillance, possibly experimental platforms for weapon systems of various types, and almost certainly the ability to monitor U.S. orbital assets with enough precision to maintain something approaching strategic parity. The stealth technology that China developed manifested most clearly in the Chinese stealth suit found in various Fallout games, has properties that suggest a sophisticated understanding of material science and electromagnetic concealment that would have been applicable to orbital systems as well as ground based ones. A stealth satellite, a platform designed to be difficult or impossible to track using pre war detection systems, would have been an enormously valuable military asset, and the fact that the Chinese stealth suit exists as a concrete artifact suggests that the research programs that produced it were well advanced enough to have produced results in multiple domains. What happened to Chinese orbital assets at the moment of the Great War is, like so much else from that period, not directly accessible in the historical record available through the games. The reasonable inference is that orbital platforms without active maintenance would have experienced orbital decay over the 2 centuries following the war and would have returned to the atmosphere, burning up on re entry in a cascade of small shooting stars, visible only to the most attentive of observers, and generating a series of small metallic impact sites that no one was in a position to study or document. The Chinese space program, like so many other things, returned to Earth and was absorbed into the ruin without leaving any clear record of what it had been. There is, in the Commonwealth of Fallout 4, a story that occupies a peculiar position in the relationship between the wasteland and the concept of flight. Not quite space travel, not quite conventional aviation, but something in the gap between them that is entirely characteristic of how the Fallout universe approaches its more eccentric possibilities. The USS Constitution is a pre war naval vessel, a reproduction of a historical ship, in fact, that has been retrofitted by the Protectron robots still faithfully serving aboard it, with rocket boosters taken from various pre war aerospace sources. The robots of the USS Constitution are operating under programming that was designed for a very different situation. They understand their mission as maritime in nature. The ship must complete its voyage to England as per the orders that were coded into their operation at some point in the pre war period. The fact that the ship is landlocked, elevated on the roof of a ruined urban building, and surrounded by a wasteland rather than an ocean presents no conceptual obstacle to Protectrons programmed to sail rather than to assess the feasibility of sailing. The ship must go, therefore, the ship will go. The rockets are one proposed solution to the problem of getting it there. What the Constitution's crew has assembled with the particular kind of mechanical ingenuity that pre war robots demonstrate when given decades to work on a problem is a jury rigged aerospace system of doubtful reliability but genuine ambition. The rockets are not designed to propel a historical naval reproduction across the Atlantic Ocean. They were designed for entirely different applications in entirely different contexts. But rockets are rockets, and the Protectrons of the Constitution have read enough pre war documentation about their application to believe, with the unshakable confidence that only a machine optimized for a specific task can maintain, that their plan will work. Whether it does work, and what happens if it does, is something that depends on how a traveler chooses to interact with the ship's crew. The Constitution's story is simultaneously a comedy of misapplied engineering, a tribute to the stubbornness of programming in the face of reality, and a quietly moving meditation on what happens when the beings responsible for maintaining a mission outlast everyone who understood what the mission was actually for. The robots of the Constitution are doing their jobs. Their jobs no longer make sense in any context that currently exists. They are doing them anyway, with full commitment, because that is what they were built to do. In the Fallout universe, this quality is treated as simultaneously absurd and admirable, which is probably the correct response to it. Returning to ArcJet systems and the deeper implications of their deep space relay project, it is worth sitting with the question of what the pre war scientists who designed and built it thought they were reaching toward. The DSR was not a military project in its conception, even if military funding contributed to its development. It was, at its core, an act of curiosity, perhaps the purest expression of the scientific spirit that the pre-war civilization produced in the field of space research, because it was aimed not at a specific practical goal, but at an open question. Is there anyone else out there? And if there is, will they hear us if we speak loudly enough? The scientists who worked on the DSR project left behind a considerable body of documentation in the facility's terminal records, progress reports, theoretical papers, personal logs, the kind of accumulated written evidence of intellectual effort that characterizes any serious research undertaking. Reading through these records, insofar as they are accessible to a wasteland explorer centuries later, produces a particular kind of quiet affecting experience. the feeling of encountering people who were doing something they genuinely believed mattered, working on a problem they found genuinely fascinating in the final years before everything stopped. The irony of the DES-SR in the context of what the mothership Zeta Dual LC reveals about the Fallout universe is not entirely comfortable. The pre-war scientists at ArcJet were trying to reach out to whatever existed in deep space to initiate contact with a universe they believed was probably populated with other minds. Meanwhile, a spacecraft from somewhere in that same universe had been hovering above the planet for longer than any of those scientists had been alive, conducting its own research into humanity with perfect indifference to whether humanity was aware of being studied. The reaching out was unnecessary. Contact had already been made, and made many times, and the contact was exclusively on the other party's terms. What would the ArcJet scientists have thought had they known? The question is unanswerable, but worth posing, because it illuminates something about the nature of the pre-war civilization's relationship with the universe it was trying to enter. The Deep Space Relay was conceived as a first step in a dialogue, a friendly, carefully considered transmission designed to introduce Earth to whoever might be listening with the best possible combination of mathematical clarity and cultural warmth. The assumption built into the project was that contact, when it came, would be something that both parties chose and participated in equally. That assumption, like so many assumptions of the pre-war world, was not quite right. The story of Jason Bright and the Bright Brotherhood deserves a second, quieter look, not at the practical mechanics of their rocket launch, which were covered in the sections about REPCON, but at the emotional and philosophical texture of what they were doing and why. Because the Bright Brotherhood's plan to leave Earth is not merely an eccentric plot device or a piece of spectacular quest design. It is a meditation on what it means to be unwanted in the world you were born into, and what alternatives are available when the world makes its unwelcomeness sufficiently clear. Ghouls in the Fallout universe occupy a position of consistent discrimination. They are visibly different from unaffected humans in ways that immediately register as threatening or repulsive to many people in the wasteland, regardless of whether the individual ghoul in question has any intention of causing harm. The distinction between feral ghouls, who have lost their capacity for reason and operate on aggressive instinct, and fully conscious ghouls who retain complete human intellectual and emotional function, is a distinction that much of the wasteland population either does not understand or chooses not to apply. The result is that conscious ghouls frequently live in conditions of social exclusion that range from mild to severe, and that the history of their interactions with unaffected human communities is frequently one of rejection. Jason Bright's response to this situation was not anger, at least not primarily. It was theology. He constructed, from the materials available to his mind and his community's experience, a belief system that took the fact of their rejection and reframed it as preparation. They had been changed by radiation. They had been driven from human communities. They had found themselves in a rocket testing facility. These were not misfortunes. They were stages in a journey. The rejection was not the end of their story, but a necessary step toward the beginning of a better one. This is, in its deepest structure, an ancient human theological move, the conversion of suffering into meaning, applied to a situation that would have seemed incomprehensible to any theology that preceded the atomic age. What is moving about the Bright Brotherhood is not that their theology was true in any verifiable sense, but that it worked. It gave a community of beings who had every reason for despair a sense of direction and purpose and shared identity powerful enough to sustain years of patient, unglamorous, technically demanding preparation. They studied, they worked, they maintained, they believed, and when the time came, they launched, which is more than most of the people who ever doubted them or feared them or drove them away were ever able to say about their own dreams. The rockets go up. The Brotherhood goes with them. Whatever happens next, they chose the stars over the wasteland, and in a universe whose dominant tone is the slow, heavy weight of things that have been destroyed and cannot be rebuilt, that choice carries a lightness that is hard to account for and harder still to dismiss. The pre-war world's relationship with the space age went far deeper than rockets and research programs and military satellites. It permeated the aesthetic language of the civilization at every level, from the design of its most monumental public buildings to the shape of the everyday objects on its kitchen tables. The space age in Fallout was also an aesthetic philosophy, a conviction that the future was coming and that the future looked a particular way, streamlined and luminous and unencumbered by the weight of history, built from materials that shone and surfaces that glided and forms that suggested motion even when standing still. The architecture of the pre-war world in Fallout reflects this conviction throughout. Government buildings have the confident, elevated geometry of structures designed to be impressive from a distance and to suggest, through their very shape, that what happens inside them is part of a larger project of human advancement. Corporate headquarters soar with the particular ambition of institutions that believed they were building the infrastructure of a civilization that was headed somewhere extraordinary. Even ordinary suburban homes, the kind scattered throughout sanctuary hills and neighborhoods like it, carry in their mid-century design language the assumption that the future was going to be good, that technology was going to deliver on its promises, that the trajectory was upward. This aesthetic was also a form of propaganda, in the most literal sense. It propagated a particular set of beliefs about the pre-war world and its direction. The sleek lines of an ArcJet Systems building said, to everyone who walked past it, that science was going somewhere worth going. The bright colors of the galactic zone said that space was exciting and friendly and commercially available. The Jangles the Moon Monkey toy said that even the smallest member of the family was part of the adventure. The aesthetic was comprehensive enough that it was hard, living inside it, to perceive it as a choice rather than a simple description of reality, which is, of course, how the most successful aesthetic propaganda always works. In the wasteland, this aesthetic survives in a state of beautiful and terrible decay. The gleaming surfaces are corroded. The soaring structures are partially collapsed. The confident geometry of the pre-war buildings is interrupted by blast damage and structural failure and 2 centuries of weather. but the form beneath the damage is still legible, and that legibility is part of what gives the Fallout world its particular emotional quality. The sense of a vision so strongly held that it survives its own destruction, visible in the ruins not as a triumphant achievement, but as a persistent ghost, still pointing toward a future that never arrived. Among the many achievements of Robco Industries, the pre war megacorporation responsible for, among other things, the Pip-Boy series of wrist mounted computing devices. The least visible, and perhaps the most consequential, was their contribution to communications infrastructure. Robco maintained in the pre war period a network of communication satellites that supported everything from basic radio relay to the Pip-Boy's ability to receive broadcast signals from stations distant enough that ground based transmission alone could not have covered the range. The Pip-Boy, in this context, is not merely a personal computing device. It is a node in a satellite supported network, a ground terminal in a miniaturized form factor, connected to a system of orbital infrastructure that allowed it to receive time signals, location data, and broadcast content from sources that might be hundreds of miles distant. This makes it, quietly, one of the most space dependent, everyday objects in the pre war world, a piece of technology that the average person wore on their wrist and interacted with daily without ever thinking of it as space technology, because the space technology was invisible, happening silently in orbit, doing its work without requiring any acknowledgement from the people it served. In the post war world, some of the Robco satellites continue to function. Orbital decay is a slow process for satellites placed in sufficiently high orbits, and some of those placed high enough before the war are presumably still circling, still transmitting their timing signals and broadcast relays to receivers below. This is why the Pip-Boy and its successor devices still function as broadcast receivers in the wasteland, picking up stations that operate from towers and transmitters scattered across the landscape. The infrastructure that makes this possible is partly on the ground, partly in the air, and partly quietly, invisibly, undramatically, in the sky above the sky, in the silent domain where the pre war world left its most patient legacy. What this means for the average wastelander carrying a Pip-Boy is something they would likely never think about. The device on their wrist is connected, however tenuously, however imperfectly, to a network that the pre war world placed in orbit as a matter of routine infrastructure investment. The stars, for anyone looking at a Pip-Boy screen in the Commonwealth, are not merely light. They are, in a very small and particular way, functional, still serving, still transmitting, still doing the jobs they were built to do, above a world that has largely stopped knowing they exist. In the months and weeks before the Great War, the pre-war space program was not operating at the height of its ambitions. The resource conflicts that were driving the world toward catastrophe had already begun to affect the budget allocations that sustained the scientific programs, and the military's claim on aerospace technology was growing stronger at the expense of the civilian research side of the equation. Engineers who had spent careers working on exploration missions found themselves reassigned to weapons projects. Research programs were classified or canceled. The civilian space agency's public role was maintained as a piece of national morale management, even as its actual capabilities were quietly redirected toward purposes that had less to do with knowing the universe and more to do with surviving the wars being planned within it. This shift is visible in the terminal records scattered throughout Fallout's pre war facilities, in the particular quality of institutional fatigue and redirected purpose that characterizes the documentation of that final period. The scientists who worked in these facilities knew on some level that what they were doing had changed, even if they didn't always know exactly how. The exploration work felt increasingly like cover for something else. The research that felt most meaningful, the deep space relay, the long range communication programs, the pure science of understanding the cosmos, was being sidelined in favor of applications that the military found more immediately useful. And then the bombs fell, and all of it stopped, and the question of what the pre war space program might have eventually achieved became permanently hypothetical. The rockets that were on launch pads remained on launch pads. The satellites in orbit continued in their orbits. The facilities fell silent. The dreams that had been built into those facilities, the genuine, earnest dreams of people who wanted to know what was out there, went quiet along with everything else. What survives is not the program, but its artifacts. The rockets, the suits, the computers, the facilities, the documentation. These things are still there, in varying states of preservation, waiting for whoever comes along with enough curiosity and enough patience to recognize what they were part of. The pre war space program did not produce a spacefaring civilization. It produced a set of tools and a body of knowledge that was then preserved, imperfectly but persistently, in the ruins of the world it tried to serve. The story is not over. The tools are still there. And in the Fallout universe, tools have a way of finding new purpose in the hands of people who were never part of the original plan. There is a particular quality to the way the Fallout universe handles its space lore that becomes apparent only when you step back and look at the full inventory of what is present. It is not concentrated in a single place, or a single game, or a single narrative thread. It is distributed throughout the wasteland in the same way that radiation is distributed, invisibly, unevenly, in higher concentrations in some places than others, but essentially everywhere, part of the ambient texture of the world rather than a feature that stands out and demands attention. The crashed UFOs in 3 different games, the alien abduction in a 4th, the orbital weapons platform in New Vegas, the rocket ghouls of Repcon, the space cult in San Francisco, the deep space transmitter at ArcJet, the theme park in the mountains, the lunar lander reference, the satellite network, the Jangles toys, the spacesuits, the alien blaster, the orbital missiles in Appalachia, the Archimedes solar weapon. Each of these things is present in its own game, in its own context, connected to its own story. Each of them, taken individually, is interesting and well realized. Together, they constitute something considerably larger than any individual piece would suggest. A picture of a world that had a complicated, multi-layered, unresolved relationship with space, with the cosmos, with the question of what was out there and what it meant for what was down here. The relationship was never resolved because the Great War interrupted it. The questions that the pre war civilization was asking about space were left hanging in the air at the moment of impact, along with all the other questions that civilization had accumulated and never gotten around to answering. But the questions are still there, embedded in the artifacts and the facilities and the cultural remnants that the wasteland preserves. And they are still being asked in their quiet way by every wanderer who follows a strange radio signal to a hilltop or finds a toy monkey in an astronaut suit in a ruined bedroom or steps into the shadow of a ruined rocket on a pad that has been waiting for 200 years to be used. The stars don't answer, but the wasteland keeps asking. In the end, what the space lore of Fallout tells us about the universe it inhabits is something gentle and a little persistent. The pre war world reached toward the stars with a combination of scientific ambition and corporate opportunism and genuine wonder that is entirely characteristic of the civilization as a whole. The best and the worst of it intertwined so thoroughly that separating them is impossible. The rockets were built for exploration and for warfare. The theme parks were built for wonder and for profit. The religious communities that formed around the idea of space were built from sincere belief and from the very human need to make meaning out of circumstances that otherwise resist it. None of this was resolved. All of it was interrupted. And what remains is a wasteland that carries the traces of a dream in its ruins, in the rockets still waiting on their pads, in the satellites still circling above, in the alien spacecraft still hovering at the edge of atmosphere, in the ghouls who once launched themselves toward somewhere better, in the children's toys shaped like moon-going monkeys that outlasted the children and the civilization and the moon missions and almost everything else. There is a particular tenderness in Fallout's space lore that distinguishes it from the rest of the wasteland's often grim and weighted storytelling. Space in Fallout is the direction that hope pointed. It was where the pre-war world believed the future lived, and where various post-war communities, the hubologists, the Bright Brotherhood, the scientists at ArcJet, continued to look when the surface world offered nothing but ruin. The stars were not reachable for most of them, but the lookets was real, and the reaching was real, and in a universe that is as honest about the weight of loss as Fallout is, that realness is worth pausing over. The wasteland remembers its dreams in its artifacts. The space age left behind its own particular kind of artifact, patient, technical, aimed upward, still functioning in many cases, still transmitting, still waiting. If you know where to look and how to listen, the pre-war world's conversation with the cosmos is still ongoing in the ruins, conducted by machines that were built to last and have lasted, speaking to an audience that is mostly gone, about a future that is mostly lost, in a universe that continues regardless. Behind every rocket and satellite and orbital weapon and lunar lander in the Fallout universe, there were at some point people, engineers who designed the systems, technicians who maintained them, and pilots who flew them. The pre-war space program required an astronaut corps of some kind, a group of trained individuals selected and prepared to do what very few human beings could physically and psychologically endure, to leave the surface of the Earth to pass through the boundary of the atmosphere into the void beyond, and to do whatever the mission required in an environment that would kill an unprotected human being in seconds. The people who did this work in the alternate history of Fallout are not named or detailed in the games, in the same way that specific engineers or factions or corporate leaders are, but their existence is implied by everything the pre war space program left behind, and the culture that formed around them is visible in the toys and memorabilia and promotional materials preserved across the wasteland. The pre war astronaut in Fallout's cultural landscape was not merely a technical specialist. They were a symbol, the most visible embodiment of the pre war civilization's forward momentum, the person who physically occupied the space that everyone else was dreaming about. Their images appeared on cereal boxes and in advertising campaigns and on the covers of magazines and as the inspiration for the toys that children slept with at night. The Jangles the Moon Monkey toy was in this sense a proxy for the astronaut, a domesticated, friendly, child-appropriate version of the kind of person who climbed into a rocket and went somewhere no one had been. The toy was popular because the astronaut was admired, and the astronaut was admired because they represented the whole civilization's most optimistic reading of itself. What the astronauts of Fallout's pre war world actually experienced in their flights is something that the games touch on only indirectly. In the technical documentation preserved in space agency facilities, in the artifacts recovered from orbital missions, in the equipment designed for human use, in environments where human beings were not meant to naturally be. But the experience implied by that documentation is one of extraordinary physical and psychological challenge. The vacuum tube computers that guided their vehicles were reliable, but not precise by modern standards. The communications delays that complicated orbital operations were significant. The life support systems, though engineered with great care, were mechanical systems subject to the ordinary vulnerabilities of mechanical systems under stress. The people who flew in these conditions were, by any measure, exceptionally capable individuals, selected for the combination of technical competence, physical resilience, and psychological stability that the program required, and then trained to a degree of professional excellence that made them among the most prepared human beings their civilization had produced. And then the world that selected them and trained them and celebrated them ended, and they became, like so many other things from that world, part of the historical record that the wasteland preserves imperfectly and reads with incomplete understanding. Their legacy is in the equipment they used, the facilities they trained in, the cultural products that formed around their image, and in the persistent human tendency, visible throughout the post war world, to look up at the sky and wonder what is possible. In the mountains and forests of Appalachia, the landscape that would once have been West Virginia holds its own quiet relationship with the space age. The pre-war space program touched Appalachia primarily through the industrial and military infrastructure that the region supported, the missile silos already discussed, the communication facilities connected to the White Spring bunker, and various smaller installations whose connection to orbital and aerospace programs is evident from their technical specifications even if their precise purpose was never recorded in any documentation that survives intact. Among the most visually striking remnants of the space age in Appalachia is the Lone Star rocket, a vehicle that tells its own particular story about the intersection of corporate ambition and aerospace aspiration in the pre war worlds. The rocket is a physical artifact of considerable size, preserved in a state that suggests it was never launched, never fueled, never counted down, never sent on whatever mission it was built for. It sits in the landscape of Appalachia as a monument to a plan that was interrupted, whether by the Great War or by some earlier failure of circumstances. The engineering that went into it is evident from its construction. A vehicle built with the same mix of ambition and practical robustness that characterized pre-war aerospace manufacturing throughout the country. Appalachia's relationship with the space age also includes the more atmospheric and less concrete presence of a program that was clearly ongoing in the region at the time the bombs fell. The satellite uplink facilities that dot the Appalachian landscape, some of them still functional, still receiving and transmitting signals, still going through their operational cycles with the patience of systems whose operators were not expected to be gone this long, represent the ground-based half of an orbital network that was still in active use at the moment of the Great War. The signals that these facilities continue to process 200 years later are signals that were last sent by systems whose human operators are long dead, processed by receivers whose maintenance schedules have long since lapsed into the realm of the purely theoretical. There is something quietly extraordinary about the Appalachian landscape in this respect. The combination of the extraordinary natural beauty of the mountains and forests with the rusting remnants of orbital infrastructure, the wildlife that has reclaimed abandoned launch pads, the trees that have grown through the concrete of tracking station foundations. The natural world and the space age are not enemies in the Fallout universe, or at least not entirely. They are neighbors, sharing territory that the human civilization that created the space age is no longer around to adjudicate between them, finding their own equilibrium in the absence of anyone with a strong preference about the outcome. It is not possible to fully understand Fallout's space lore without understanding the relationship between the atomic age and the space age in the pre-war world's cultural imagination. In the alternate timeline of Fallout, these two things were not separate developments, but facets of a single, unified conviction, the belief that energy, applied intelligently and fearlessly, could do anything that human ambition required of it. The same intellectual and engineering culture that split the atom and built the bomb also looked at that same technology and said, if we can release this much energy from this small a quantity of matter, we can reach the stars. The bomb and the rocket were siblings, in this sense, born from the same parent in sight, pointed in very different directions. The fusion technology that powered the pre-war world in Fallout, the clean, essentially limitless energy source that ran everything from household appliances to military vehicles, was also the technology that made the pre-war space program more powerful than our own equivalent. A fusion-powered rocket engine produces thrust of a magnitude that chemical rockets cannot approach, which meant that the pre war space program's vehicles were enormously capable, even if their guidance systems and computers were considerably less sophisticated than a modern perspective would consider adequate. Power compensated for precision in a way that is characteristically pre war. The solution to the problem of guidance was not to make the guidance better, but to make the engines powerful enough that the margins for error were substantially wider. This relationship between energy and ambition is one of the most consistent